Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience, and welcome to our press conference. So I'm really honored to be here today. My name is Kirsty Gogan. I'm Executive Director of Energy for Humanity. We're a new environmental NGO. Now, our focus is on two of the great humanitarian challenges that we face in this century: how to dramatically cut carbon emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change in our own lifetimes and that of our children. And then secondly, lifting billions of people out of poverty to achieve the quality of life that we all take for granted. So both of these challenges have one thing in common: the energy that we use to power our world. So it's my great honor this afternoon to introduce four of the world's most famous and highly regarded climate scientists. I will allow them to, of course, they'll introduce themselves, but I'll make a short introduction. We'll begin with Ken Caldeira, and then we'll work our way down the line. They'll speak for around 5 minutes each, and then we want to leave plenty of time to take lots of questions from all of you journalists that have gathered here today. So Ken Caldeira is a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution of Science, where he has a wonderful job. His job is to make important scientific discoveries. He also serves as a professor by courtesy of the Stanford University Department of Earth System Science, and he's a member of the committee producing the 2015 US National Academy of Sciences report, Geoengineering Climate, Technical Evaluation and Discussion of Impacts. He's a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the AR5 report for Climate Change 2013, the Physical Science Basis, and in 2010 he was co-author of the 2010 US National Academy America Climate Choices report, and was elected a Fellow of the American Geophysical Union. He participated in the UK Royal Society Geoengineering Panel in 2009 and Ocean Acidification Panel in 2005. Ken was coordinating lead author of the Oceans chapter for the 2005 IPCC report on carbon capture and storage. Over to you, Ken.
Well, thank you, Kirsty. So I guess I can get my slides up here. Let me start off with a little bit of biographical information. First of all, this is the first COP meeting that I've been to. I'm a climate scientist. I'm not a politician. And there's never been before I felt a reason for me to show up at an event like this. And I think things are getting serious enough that it's worth me taking time out of my normal work to try to communicate to a broader policy community. Is it possible to get my slides up there? Or so many years ago, I was protesting against nuclear power at the Shoreham nuclear power plant on Long Island, and I was arrested protesting nuclear power. And at that time, I thought, oh, if we had bioenergy and some wind and solar, that would be enough to solve the problem. And I've come now to see that the magnitude of the problem is so great that we can't afford to leave technologies unused that could potentially help. And so I think we've seen some history where people are hitching various agendas to the climate agenda. So, some people say, oh, okay, we can't solve the climate problem unless we also solve the issue of capitalism versus other systems, or we can't solve the climate problem. We have to bring in some anti-nuclear or other agendas. And I think what we're asking for here is really that we need a technologically neutral, even playing field, that we need to rise above. Could I go back to the previous slide? I don't know what's happening with the slides. That we need to rise above prejudice and address the climate problem with the urgency and thoughtful way. And that means that we can't go on pushing technologies off the table due to prejudice. We need to look at each technology and what it's capable of doing and what its pros and cons are and costs, and let each technology for itself on its own merits. The climate system cares about our greenhouse gas emissions. It cares about our CO2 emissions, and we need energy. So the amount of energy we get per unit CO2 emitted is an important and climate relevant property. but whether a dam or cutting down a forest and burning it in a bioenergy plant, whether that's better or worse than nuclear power, is not something that needs to be integrated into the basic climate mitigation message. That basically what we need is carbon emission-free power to power civilization so we can have economic growth while preserving the environment. Could I see the slides again, just to remind my... Okay, so I would like to make at this point 3 basic points, and that is, to solve the climate problem, we need to stop using the sky as a waste dump, and which basically means we need to stop building things with smokestacks or tailpipes. That each increment of emission causes another increment of warming, and so if we want to not have further increments of warming, we need to stop having further emissions. There's really only one technology that I know of that can provide carbon-free power when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing at the scale that modern civilization requires, and that's nuclear power. And whatever you think of nuclear power, we need to let it compete on its own merits, given an appropriate regulatory environment and a sensible, cost-competitive market situation. But we shouldn't discriminate against individual technologies. And the last point is that it's not about either or. We're not talking about do we favor solar power, wind, or nuclear power. I'm in favor of anything that can prevent climate change and preserve the environment and allow poor people to get food and health care and education. And so I guess the basic plea here is let's push these other agendas about, let's focus on the climate agenda. And the climate agenda is about supplying energy in a way that does not damage our environment. And we need to allow technologies to compete on their own merits. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. So next we have Kerry Emanuel. He's an American professor of atmospheric science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In particular, Kerry is focused on atmospheric convection and the mechanisms acting to intensify hurricanes. He's the author or co-author of over 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 2 books, including Divine Wind, The History and Science of Hurricanes, and the wonderful book, What We Know About Climate Change, published by MIT Press. He was named one of Time 100 most influential people in 2006, and in 2007 elected a member of the United States National Academy of Sciences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. And there are many ways I'd rather be back in my laboratory studying hurricanes today. But let me tell you why I'm here. As Kirsty just told you, I work for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and we have an old-fashioned motto in Latin, which is mens et manus, which means mind and hands. And we're very much about solving problems. I've worked, and all 4 of us have devoted substantial fractions of our professional lives to understanding the fundamental physics, chemistry, biology of the climate system. And we got into it because we want to understand it. We didn't have any ulterior baggage there. But that study of the climate system has very strongly led us to the conclusion that we are incurring unacceptable risk for future generations. I think that's why we're all here, right? Solve the problem. Now, as Ken properly said, there are a lot of people who see this as an opportunity to advance one agenda or another. Okay, I think we have to be conscious of that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But why are 4 climate scientists who don't have strong backgrounds in nuclear physics here talking to you today about nuclear energy? It's because we're scientists and we can do the math, right? If we truly are sincere about solving this problem, unless a miracle occurs, we are going to have to ramp up nuclear energy very fast. That's the reality. That's not my ideology. I don't care whether it's nuclear, like my friend Ken said. We don't care whether it's nuclear or solar or hydro, whatever combination works. The numbers don't add up unless you put nuclear power in the mix. Now, having said that, I want to say one other thing. In preparing for this day today, I've had the delightful experience of spending 3 or 4 weeks talking intensely to nuclear physicists at MIT, giving myself a crash course in this. And I think we're all in the position of not being as negative as nuclear power as Ken was in the days when he went out and protested it, because we have a new generation coming along. We have many new designs of nuclear generation. We don't have to be talking about the 1950s and 1960s power plants anymore. Some of the technology coming along is genuinely exciting. It's not just, it's the least bad of many alternatives. It could power the world in a way that will allow underdeveloped countries to very rapidly increase their standard of living, which, by the way, historically is the first step in controlling population. So let me just finish by saying that I think we could be looking at a very bright future. Not only will we solve this climate problem, but we can start to solve a lot of other problems that face humanity as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kerry. So I'd like to invite Tom now to make a few comments. Tom is a climate scientist with the University of Adelaide. And he was named a Fellow of the American Association of Advancement of Sciences, yes, for his major contributions to climate and carbon cycle modeling, but also because he's one of the world's foremost experts on climate change and one of the most highly cited scientists in his discipline. He's contributed to many of the IPCC reports, and including the contribution of many scientists, was also recognized by the joint award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kirsty. I should say that I want to make sure that you understand exactly what is going on here, and that is that, you know, we're not promoting nuclear energy, we're promoting a level playing field. We're asking everybody to make sure that, because this is such a demanding, challenging problem, that we can't close the door to any type of technology. We have to give a fair and balanced assessment, eschewing ideology and preconceptions to decide on what the energy strategy should be for the future. One of the goals of this particular Conference of Parties is to endorse the so-called INDC, Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, and as a start, and those contributions go to the year 2030. So that's just a starting point. What happens after 2030 is probably more important in terms of the reductions of emissions that we can produce. Can you still hear me? Oh, yeah, sorry. But what's important about the first few decades from now... Really? Yeah, okay. Is that the decisions we make in the next 5, 10, 15 years will determine what's possible after 2030. So this initial period, ratifying the INDCs, making sure that we don't just look for, say, a renewable energy target, but we look for a clean energy target future. I mean, that's the primary concern of this particular meeting. I should say that, my background originally is in meteorology, but my PhD happens to be in theoretical physics, and in particular in plasma physics. And that's one of the technologies that's out there on the longer timescale, and that is fusion energy. But timescales are important. Nuclear energy is a proven technology. We can ramp up nuclear energy construction quite rapidly, as it's been done in France and in Sweden, whereas things like fusion energy are long timescale possibilities. we have to think of what we can do now in these coming decades. I should say that one of the things that we've produced is a nuclear energy fact sheet. It's quite long and it's quite technical, but for people who want to find out a little bit more of our attitude, why we think nuclear energy is important, what the pros and cons of nuclear energy are relative to other forms of energy technology, then there are copies of this fact sheet available. So, I can recommend that to you. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. And now it's piling on the honours here. I'm very honoured to introduce Dr. James Hansen, who's, of course, widely regarded as having been the first to raise the alarm about climate change more than 25 years ago. Jim's, in recent years, become a climate activist for action to mitigate of climate change, which on a few occasions has led to his arrest. But from 1981 to 2013, of course, he was the head of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City. And as of 2014, he now directs the program of climate science, awareness and solutions at Columbia University's Earth Institute. And this program is working to connect the dots from advancing basic climate science to promoting public awareness for advocating policy actions. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. I want to show a couple of charts to just remind us of what's at stake, and then tell a little story that will take a couple of minutes. Could I have my first chart? I hope you have it. There we are. Yeah, I like to emphasize the climate impacts that are irreversible. We are at a point now where it's extremely dangerous. We are at the point where if the planet gets much warmer, we are going to get instability of ice sheets and sea level rise of at least several meters. And the consequences of that are almost incalculable. Half of the large cities in the world are on coastlines. The other thing that's irreversible is extermination of species. If we stay on business as usual, IPCC estimates that by the end of the century, we could commit a quarter to a half of the species on the planet to extinction. And then, of course, there are lots of climate impacts that we're already beginning to see and which would get a lot worse. Could I have the next chart? And this is my last chart with words, but I want to remind us that there are some tremendous injustices in this climate change. One of them is the intergenerational injustice. Our parents did not know that they were causing a problem for future generations by changing climate. But now we can only pretend that we don't know. We have the potential to leave our children with a situation that is out of their control. The second injustice is the North-South. The climate change is caused almost entirely by nations, the developed nations of the North. But the consequences are felt more strongly by the nations at low latitudes, who did almost nothing to cause the problem. And then the third injustice is one species to all of the other millions of species on the planet. We're essentially taking over the planet without any regard to the well-being of the other species on the planet. Okay, now the 2-minute story I would like to say is about my grandson, Connor. I don't like to tell my grandchildren about that there's a problem, that I don't like them to worry, because children can become very concerned. They can take things very seriously, and you don't want to scare young children. So I never mention this. What I do is try to introduce my grandchildren to nature. So, for example, we plant milkweeds for the monarch butterfly. But 3 years ago, I was giving a talk in the backyard at a beach house where we were staying with a friend, And I thought the grandchildren had all gone to bed, except Sophie, who's the oldest, and she's now 17 years old. So it's okay for her to know about this story. And in fact, she's a co-plaintiff on a lawsuit against Obama and the federal government. But Connor was 5 years younger. He was only 8 years old. I thought he was in bed. Well, at the end of my talk, my wife noticed Connor in the back row, and there were tears running down his cheeks. Connor is a very sensitive, he's frustratingly quiet, but he's a very sensitive boy and a very kind boy. So my wife quickly went to him and said, "Oh, don't worry, Connor. Grown-ups are working on this problem. They're going to solve the problem." Yeah, we should be solving the problem. But 3 years later, when his older sister is doing things and being a plaintiff on a lawsuit and things, and he said he wanted to do something too. So he talked with his mother, and then he wrote down his thoughts, and I want to show those on the final chart, because he captured some really important points. First of all, he says, unless we can figure out how to make a time machine that actually works, there's going to be no way to fix this. And that is the fundamental issue with this problem. The system has inertia. So we've only felt half of the response due to the gases already in the atmosphere. So if we don't solve the problem now, we're going to hand young people a situation in which the only way they can fix it is with a time machine. And who believes that you actually have one? And the other thing that he concluded was, grown-ups are scared of nuclear power. But he says they should be scared of climate change. We know that using fossil fuels is not safe. It is very dangerous. And we have to face the fact that this danger of fossil fuels is staring us in the face. It's absolutely 100% certain that we've got a very dangerous situation. And for us to say, oh, we're not going to use all the tools that we have to try to solve it is crazy. We have to use all of the things that we have at our disposal. And clearly, nuclear power, next generation nuclear power especially, has tremendous potential to be a big part of the solution. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I would like to open the floor to some questions. I would ask, please, that you announce who you are. We'd like to prioritize journalists. Please say your name and where you're coming from. Many thanks. Gentleman here at the front.
Thank you. Seth Bornstein, the Associated Press. 2 questions. One for Jim and whoever else wants to jump in. Can you quantify for us the difference between reaching the goal of no more than 2 degrees C, and the goal of no more than 1.5 degrees C, which is being talked about a lot here? And then the second one, a nuclear power question for you all. John Sturman, a colleague of yours at MIT, Carrie, said he's done the numbers. That while nuclear power could help, there's no way, since it takes so long, it takes 10, 15 years, by that time it's just too late. Does it make sense when it just takes too long to ramp up nuclear power, given the history? Especially in the United States, you're looking at 10 to 15 years to license. Isn't that too late? Do 2 degrees first, please.
Yeah, well, I have a paper that will soon be that argues very strongly that 2 degrees is a disaster scenario. For one thing, we just look at the Earth's history. The Eemian, the last interglacial period, was at most 2 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial, probably somewhat less than that. And sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher. So that's a crazy target to have. You cannot say that's a guardrail, a safe guardrail. I prefer not to use temperature as a criterion because we can now measure the Earth's energy imbalance. And what that tells us is, other things being equal, we would have to reduce CO2 from 400 ppm to about 350 ppm. And I think the atmospheric composition is a better target than temperature. 1.5 degrees is certainly less dangerous than 2 degrees, but I wouldn't even characterize that as a guardrail. We really have to restore the planet's energy balance if we want climate to be approximately stabilized.
So, Seth, first of all, I very much agree with my colleague John Sturman. 10 to 15 years is about right. To him, that sounds like a long time. To me, that sounds remarkable. I mean, Sweden and France this country that we're in, went from almost no nuclear power to 80% electricity in something like 15 years. What are our other options? We can scale up solar and wind pretty quickly up to a certain limit, and then we run headlong into the barriers dictated by intermittency. And we should do that. And I don't think anybody in this group of 4 scientists are opposed to doing that. But we have to understand the limitations. I would only answer your point by saying it's the best, and we're not even doing that. We ought to be doing that.
Let me just throw in one thing to say that it's not only nuclear that needs to scale up extremely rapidly, but it's also solar and wind that to solve the climate problem, we need to scale up every technology that makes sense as fast as we can.
I just want to add something to what Jim said, and that is, my personal view is that a 2-degree target is something that it's useful to strive towards now, but in the longer run, it's too warm. We're going to have a target that's lower than that. And there are a number of reasons. One is that at a 2-degree target, sea level continues to rise for centuries at roughly the same rate. And even with a 1.5-degree target, sea level will continue to rise in the future. So that is a challenge, but it's not our grandchildren's challenge. It's line, but it's still a real challenge. The other issue with regard to a 450 parts per million stabilization level, which is roughly where the 2-degree comes from, and a 350 parts per million stabilization level, is that to get to 350 degrees, we actually have to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere somehow. And I don't think we can do it by growing lots and lots of trees. So that really then gets back to one of the specialities that Ken Caldera deals with, and that's geoengineering. So that's something that has to be at least kept in the background of the options that might become necessary at some point in the future.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we have a lady here. If we need a bit of help from the production team passing the mic, and Gail, I don't know if you could help passing.
Hello.
So the mic is. Oh, well, you can be next. Thank you.
Oh.
Please say your name.
This is Judy Searle here from Cape Town Television and South African Television. Nuclear power is actually a massive fossil fuel user. If you incorporate the amount of petrol that's used in order to extract it and the amount of energy that's used to refine it and then disposing of the tailings. And also it's a huge user of water. So as far as I'm concerned, nuclear in some cases is not even to be considered more even a net producer of energy. So I'm surprised to hear that such concerned people are advocating it.
Okay, thank you very much. Should we take...
Life cycle assessments of CO2 emissions associated with different energy technologies place nuclear power as among the very lowest of CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour. And you can go to the most recent IPCC report, so that's a consensus statement of the energy experts that worked on that. The water use is a concern. All power plants require substantial amounts of water for cooling, and that's an issue that needs to be addressed.
Only add to what Ken just told you by saying that it's true that light water reactors use large volumes of fresh water, and that's the problem. Some of the reactor designs we'd like to move to, so-called Generation 4, most of them are based on other coolants, like molten fluoride salts, and that don't have that particular problem. So there are ways at least to get around the water problem.
Yes, and the other issue is with fourth-generation nuclear, which, you know, maybe a few decades away, but fourth-generation nuclear fast neutron reactors actually burn the waste fuel. So they, and furthermore, the waste from fourth-generation reactors is a much smaller volume and with a much shorter lifetime than the waste from present-day nuclear technology. So the next generation of reactors can solve the waste problem crucially, and also they have greater proliferation resistance. So there's technology, you know, that has been developed within the United States and is being developed elsewhere, and actually is running in some parts of the world that will solve a lot of the problems that are related to present-day nuclear technology.
Just to add one comment to that, I think that question is an example of the great difficulty that nuclear power faces. I mean, the statement was just totally false. Nuclear power's carbon footprint, even if you use fossil fuels to build the nuclear plant, is among the smallest of any energy source that we know about, contrary to what the questioner said. And there was another point I was going to make, but I've forgotten what it was. Oh, well, yeah, water. The water use of nuclear power plants. That's one of the. You know, we're going to have a workshop in China 2 weeks from now with some of the top experts in the United States and China, and that's one of the things which is very important to China. They want to have nuclear power in inland locations where they don't have water. And that's why one of the things we'll be focusing on is the new technologies that have very small, if any, water requirements.
Okay, well, I think that's answered that question. We have a question here. Please say where you're from. And
hello, my name is Ruth Kraus. I come from DW, German television. I've got a question for Mr. Hansen, if possible. We've talked now a lot about the 2-degree goals, and the comments that I heard here is really that it's too high, that 2 degrees are too high. Yet, in the delegations, actually there are quite a few delegations that really still want to stick to the 2-degree goal, even if science says other things. So why is there still the lack of acknowledgement towards science?
Well, in my opinion, and maybe some of the other panelists would like to comment on this, I don't think the targets have been set based on science. They've been set, they are convenient. You know, the 2 degrees, you know, I've gone to Germany and tried to debate with the politicians there about the policies and their plans for decreasing CO2. You know, they're building coal-fired power plants there. Though Germany is one, with the United States, the United Kingdom are the 3 countries that are most responsible on a per capita basis for change. And yet their plans are, you know, well, we're going to close our nuclear plants and we're going to start building renewables, and by the middle of the century, we may be in better shape, but when you build a new power plant, there's no intention of closing that down. And what the science says is we've got to phase off of fossil fuels. We shouldn't be building new fossil fuel power plants. It doesn't make sense. It's not consistent with what the science is telling us.
Science doesn't tell us directly what we need to be doing. Science is about establishing facts. But because we're human beings who care about other people and we care about the environment, those facts speak to us and tell us as humans what we need to be doing. And I think all of us here feel that carbon dioxide emissions are dangerous and that there's no emission that's acceptable, that we need to be stopping all carbon dioxide emissions. And I've likened it to to mugging little old ladies, and you say, okay, what should our target be for the rate of mugging little old ladies? And you say, well, the target should be 0. And that doesn't mean you necessarily think we're going to get there tomorrow, but it means that every mugging of a little old lady is a bad thing, and every carbon dioxide emission is a bad thing, and the target is 0.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question over here. Yes, gentleman.
Jeffrey Lean. Hi, Tom and others. Write for a number of papers during the Evening Standard. And actually, I wrote about advocating thorium in 1978. So I was possibly working on this rather before many of you, despite the slightly patronizing attitude some of you have had towards the press today. I do have problems both with speed, but that's been covered, but with a level playing field. Because over 50 years, billions and billions have been poured into the nuclear industry, and it hasn't delivered. Very little, by instance, has been put into solar and wind. I'm not saying that you are against them, but there has not been a level playing field between nuclear and the renewables. So to argue for it now seems to be tendentious in the extreme. Now, I'm not anti-nuclear, but I really think, as scientists, you should research your facts and be a bit more accurate.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey. So the nuclear industry hasn't delivered. Anybody?
I'm going to have a first crack at that, okay? And other people can say. I probably differ a little bit from my colleagues in that I don't think it should be a level playing field. I think we should put much more money into nuclear and stop wasting a lot on covering the Earth with solar panels. We can get to 30%, and then you hit a brick wall. We've done the numbers, have you? You cannot power the world on renewables. You can't do it unless there's a miracle, all right? We've done the math. So I'm sorry, I take exception to you. This, all right?
Okay, next question, please. So where do we have the microphone?
Here.
Oh, there we are. Thank you. Yes, Mirta.
Hi. Yes. Hello. Hello. Yes, I have a question. Thank you. My question regards, considering all the evidence and science that you've just put forward and that were very interesting to hear, my question is, how come and how would you explain that nuclear is so absent from the debate, and how come it is not much more being advocated by the different delegations and the media and so on?
Well, I can point out one or two points. What you find if you advocate, frankly, I've spoken to many scientists, and by far the majority agree that nuclear needs to be part of the solution. When you stand up and say that, there's an anti-nuclear community, which I would characterize as quasi-religious, which just hammers you. And you have to spend a lot of your time trying to deal with that. I've even found that some of the, now that I'm no longer a government employee, I have to raise the funds to cover my group of 4 people. And there are a number of foundations. The foundation that had been my most reliable source while I was a government employee, because I like to speak out is not part of my government job, but so I had to prove that I was not using government funds. So when I traveled, I had to get non-government funds to pay for that. Well, the foundation that provided the funds now will not give me a dime because they are anti-nuclear. And so there's a lot of pressure on scientists just to keep their mouths shut. But we're at a point where we better not keep our mouths shut when we can see a story which has become very clear, and that is that it's a mirage to think that all renewables can provide all of the energy that we need and at the speed we need. China and India are using tremendous amounts of power, almost all coal, for their electric plants. And there's no way that they can power their steel mills and all the other factories that they're building products for us on solar panels. You know, and they know that. The governments of China and India know that. They want modern, better, safer nuclear technology. And for the West not to help them is immoral, because we burned their share of the carbon budget. Now they're stuck. Either they want to get wealthy, they want to raise people out of poverty. They need energy to do that. You can't do it without energy. And so if they don't have an alternative, they're going to burn coal. We should be helping them to find a clean alternative.
For some reason, the word renewable has gotten tied to this idea of mitigating climate change. And renewable doesn't mean good. I live in California. I work in a department full of ecologists. And renewable, in many cases, means dams that disrupt river ecosystems. Renewable often means cutting down trees and burning them in power plants. So renewable doesn't mean environmentally acceptable. It doesn't mean good. What we want are technologies that have a small environmental footprint that can provide the power needed to power civilization with having the smallest possible environmental footprint. What we want are technologies with small environmental footprints, and many of the renewable technologies are inherently distributed and require huge amounts of area or displace natural ecosystems. What we would like is as much land possible left in the world for nature, and to make our energy system as compact and walk as environmentally lightly as possible.
I would just come back to the major theme that we introduced at the outset of this panel, is that what we're really trying to look for is the solution to this problem. And the solution isn't one panacea. It's a mixture of things. And we must not bring to that discussion ulterior motives. We should simply be trying to fix the problem in the way that's most satisfactory from an economic standpoint and from an environmental standpoint as well. That's what I think we're all here to do.
Can I just say a few words, and that is that, you know, the question of the statement was true. I mean, there is a large amount of public opinion, and it varies from country to country as well, that is, I shouldn't say directly anti-nuclear, but certainly pro what are called renewables to a fault, you know, without being realistic about for renewable energy. And, you know, part of the reason why we're here and why we're talking about the need to focus a little bit more seriously on nuclear energy is to change public opinion, you know, to educate people with engineering, technical and scientific facts.
I'd like to just briefly respond to a prior question about nuclear has not delivered. In fact, if you look at France, for example, it has most of its electricity from nuclear power. And if you compare the electricity price in France and Germany, it's about half in France what it is in Germany. And that's, of course, an old technology that France is using. But if you look at Sweden, for example, they have carbon-free electricity. That's the solution to the climate problem. If we have carbon-free electricity in all countries, we've solved the problem, because we can make liquid fuels for transportation from energy if you have abundant carbon-free electricity. And the way Sweden did it was in 10 years to build nuclear power plants and combine that with hydropower. So renewable energy plus nuclear energy provides them carbon-free electricity. And that's what we need. One final comment is to say that nuclear has been subsidized. In fact, it's not really true. You know, in the United States, the government collects from nuclear power a small percentage, adds that to the electricity bill. And they collected more than $30 billion to pay for the handling the nuclear waste. And then they just take the money and put it in the federal pot, you know, rather than actually getting a waste disposal system. But nuclear can pay for itself on the long run.
Okay, we have one more question here for the lady. Yeah. Oh. Thank you.
Mindy Aller, citizensvoice.tv. And I have a question about policy. When you talk about creating an equal playing field for all of these technologies, what types of governmental policies, such as is it a price on carbon, that would help the most carbon neutral technologies shine through? I'd like to hear that.
We're physical scientists and not policy experts, and so you have to take our policy recommendations as our own sort of normal citizens saying what we think. But I'm in favor of a strong and rapidly escalating price on carbon as sending the clearest signals to the markets. But it's not just going to be a price on carbon, because if you're going to say solar system, you need a big electricity grid, and there's going to have to be public policy to facilitate that continental scale electricity grid. And so the price on carbon is essential, but there will have to be additional policy measures to help individual technologies.
Should we take another question? Okay. Now, it's very crowded.
Can I just say one more thing?
Oh,
just that I would like to point out that this COP meeting is a little different treatment of nuclear power than under different previous meetings under the Framework Convention, in that for this meeting, each country is allowed to say what it plans to do to help meet its emission targets. And many countries are bringing nuclear in as part of the mix. I know the United States, for example, is including nuclear power as one of the technologies it plans to use to meet its climate goals. And so really this is, I think, a change under the UN Framework Convention that countries are bringing in nuclear power as a way to meet climate goals.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay, one other thing about policy. You know, one question implied that nuclear was getting subsidies. Well, when you put a renewable portfolio standard on utilities and say you've got to get 20%, 30%, whatever percent of your power from renewables, it is an incredible subsidy. Because the total cost is then passed on to all the ratepayers, and it's kind of hidden. There's no direct subsidy, but all of the costs are then incorporated into the electricity cost. So the more honest way to do this is to say, well, let's simply put a price on carbon, and then it's a fair playing field for it. That will help renewables, that will help nuclear power, it will help energy efficiency, and that's the way we should do it. Let the market decide, help us decide what is most efficient.
And if you are going to do it in terms of standards, it could be standards in terms of how much CO2 you emit per kilowatt hour or per mile or kilometer driven. And so make it a technology-neutral standard and not a technology-specific standard.
Hi, Tom Mitchell with New Matilda in Australia. You mentioned this sort of issue around the poor needing access to power, and that India and China are expanding their coal sector massively. Our environment minister was asked yesterday why he'd approved the Carmichael coal mine, which you might really humongous one in Queensland. and he said that it would be neo-colonial of him to not approve that coal mine effectively. I was just wondering if you could sort of respond to that in the context of the cost to the poor in terms of health and other issues, and you know, the way that Australia is approving vast amounts of new carbon-emitting projects.
Yeah, well, as I come from Australia, I could make a comment, and this is my personal view. You know, I think one of the problems with opening up new coal mines is that they have a decadal or multi-decadal lifetime. And so, you know, although the coal in Australia is, much of it is exported, you know, we should take responsibility for the coal that is mined in Australia and sold overseas. So, you know, personally, I'm against opening up new coal mines. But I can understand the economics and the issues of jobs and so on. So it is a difficult decision to be made, and it's even more difficult if you're a politician, of course. So, you know, I respect that these decisions are not taken lightly, even if I disagree with them.
Okay, thank you, yes.
Yeah, David Holmes from The Conversation in Australia. One of the panellists, and I don't remember which one, mentioned geoengineering. And I've got a question about, I mean, you talked about it as a kind of insurance policy. If maybe nuclear isn't working, you can throw that into the mix. But what I know is that fossil fuel companies have some vested interest in geoengineering, in that it allows them to delay you know, action on climate to keep fossil fuel going on the basis that, you know, humans can be Earth masters again and be in control with geoengineering. So is that the view of the entire panel? And I'm sorry if I'm going to put a wedge between members of the panel here.
First of all, I think the premise of the question is false, because the people who are interested in researching geoengineering are interested in it because they think the results of our carbon dioxide emissions could well be catastrophic. And in order to think that it's worth researching, you have to say that our carbon dioxide emissions will have catastrophic outcomes. And I don't think that's a position that the fossil fuel companies want. And so, and I think the reason we're here on this panel saying that we need to deploy near zero emission energy technologies today is so that we don't deploy geoengineering technologies tomorrow. So that's how
you don't think it'll become an apology for some fossil fuel companies?
I don't. In order to think you need to research geoengineering, to acknowledge that our CO2 emissions could have catastrophic consequences, and I don't think the fossil fuel companies are ready to do that.
Okay, could we pass the mic across to this gentleman there? Thank you.
Hi. Hi. I'm James George with EnviroBeat. Considering Fukushima's near miss of really contaminating Tokyo, I think nuclear is still going to be an uphill battle to convince people popularity-wise. Now, Stanford's Mark Jacobson has put forward a 100% renewable plan for all sectors with wind, water, and sunlight. Maybe you could comment on his work, because if there's an option that doesn't involve nuclear with the risk of proliferation and contamination, why wouldn't we take it?
I'll just get the ball rolling by simply saying that all forms of power entail risks, right? And that includes solar, and it includes wind. It does. Actually, mortality per kilowatt hour for solar and wind are larger historically than for nuclear. That's an established fact. But to get to the point, can we do it all with solar and wind? There are two issues. Is that the right question to ask? Is that the best way for us to... Does that actually minimize environmental impacts? Does it minimize human health risks? That's a fair question to ask. I'll pass the baton, though.
Yeah, this is something I can't vouch for, but one of the people on the panel mentioned it while we're having lunch. You know, Mark Jacobson's work is very interesting, and I think it is seriously flawed in many areas. But just to give you one example, I think, you know, there's this issue of intermittency, that the sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and, you know, if we have computerized global, nationwide for the USA grid that optimizes the distribution of power. So when the wind's blowing in one place and not in another, then we can ship the electricity from one place to another. That's fine. That gets rid of part of the issue of intermittency, but in a limited way. But I think that what Mark Jacobson says is that another way to help solve that intermittency problem is to build a whole lot of dams so that we have hydro backup. As Ken Caldera has mentioned, building another 50 Hoover dams in the United States would have a serious environmental impacts, and doing that worldwide would have devastating impacts on the lesser developed nations of the world. So I think that there are issues of social responsibility that are not addressed by a lot of the things that come out of people's work like Jacobson's work in particular.
Without going into detail, if you make unrealistic assumptions, you can end up with unrealistic conclusions, and I think that's what Mark Jacobson has done. The goal is not to make a renewable energy system. The goal is to make the most environmentally advantageous energy system we can while providing us with affordable power. And I think if a clear analysis of that will show that nuclear will be part of that story.
Okay, we have a question from this lady.
My question is twofold. One, I'm particularly worried about the waste in nuclear power.
Can you say where you're from? Just say where you're from.
Oh, sorry. Jane Lapiner. I'm from the North Coast Journal in Northern California. And because there's been no civilization on Earth that has lasted long enough to protect the waste for its half-life of, I forget what it is, but many thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. So that's one question that I really worry about. And the other is, I understand what you're saying about the intermittency of solar power, for instance, but couldn't the money that is being spent on, for instance, the nuclear power plants, the billions of dollars that was mentioned, be put to figuring out ways of storing energy so that we don't have the intermittency problem? And maybe it could be done faster in the 15 years of building it takes to build a nuclear power plant.
Okay, thank you.
Let me start off simply by...
could you pass the microphone across, please?
Let me start off by saying that the nuclear waste problem you brought up is a serious issue that needs to be tackled in any kind of system that involves nuclear fission. Down the road, there's some hope we may be able to transition to fusion, which does not have that problem, but waste is a serious problem. You can't make it go away. I would only say that this is something that that's potentially solvable in several different ways. One is injecting the waste very deep into the earth, into deep boreholes. That's been researched. A better way was already mentioned by my colleague Tom Wigley earlier in this conversation, is in the next generation of fission reactors will burn a lot of that waste in a nuclear sense. And one of the things about that waste, we call it waste, but 95% of it is potentially fuel for another reactor. And so it's waste in two senses of the word. It's wasted energy. And by burning it, you make it far less dangerous and far less voluminous. Now, about your second question, should we take money from nuclear and put it in solar? I think you'd find that all four of us, and we've said it repeatedly, think we should move on all fronts. It's not this or that. We should be pushing everything to the level that it makes sense.
And if I could add something to that, if we put a carbon price that's rising over time, then the question of where we should invest the money, in solar or nuclear or what combination, how much of this and how much of that, will be decided by the professionals who provide our energy, and will let the alternative technologies compete. but to make the decision beforehand that we're going to go all renewables and we're going to figure out storage and it'll be affordable is an extremely unwise commitment to make for our children. And the young people that I've talked to and going around to college campuses, many of them are a bit unhappy about the old geezers who are going around and trying to commit young people to future, which they'll be stuck with if we continue to pretend that renewables are capable of providing all of our energy in the near term. They want to use all of the technologies at our disposal and let them compete.
Tom Blees from the Science Council for Global Initiatives. We're a nonprofit think tank, and our goal is to provide energy egalitarianism so that everyone on the planet can have a raised standard of living. So just looking at how much energy an American uses today, if we had everyone on the planet using half that much energy, in 2050, with the anticipated population increase, it would take, according to Mark Jacobson's own figures on the land use needed for wind and solar panels, it would take, you would have to cover the entire continent of South America with wind and solar panels. Whereas with advanced nuclear power, you'd have to cover an area the size of Buenos Aires. So, the question is, who's willing to do that much environmental damage, not just from the materials that go into wind and solar, but just from covering that much land? It's absolutely unfeasible, both economically and environmentally.
That was a statement and not a question, but I can say that it's consistent with what I said earlier, that what we want is high-density power sources so that we can leave as much land as possible available for nature and other purposes.
My name is Wolfram Müller. I'm a German, European, and world citizen. Well, one issue about atomic energy is also an issue about politics in third world countries. Germany, Siemens, delivered power plants to Iran in the 70s at the time when the Shah was in power. And that turned out to be a big problem. I mean, whenever we give power, electric, like the science about nuclear energy to countries in unpolitical, stable societies, we do have a potential very huge. Another short remark is about maths. In Germany, the percentage of renewable energy was 33% last year, and Germany is far from having every piece of land full of solar panels. So I kind of doubt this this idea that you cannot thrive and live on energy on renewables. We have just look at the Sahara. I mean, another political difficult issue, but that would be another comment I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad Germany's come up. So
let me address your first point. I think the real, if you ask me what the most serious risk of nuclear is, it's something like what you mentioned. It's the potential for proliferation. And that can't be made to go away, although it can be minimized by careful governance and so forth. I would only point out that if Germany and France and the United States, countries like that, are not developing, advancing both nuclear energy and nuclear policy, right, other countries will and are. We might be able collectively to stop Western Europe and North America from advancing nuclear power, but we're not going to stop China and Russia and a whole bunch of other countries from doing that. So the issue on proliferation may come down to, who is building and marketing the best designs and coming up with the best policy. Maybe you'd like to tackle that.
I think there's some differences on the panel here. That my vision of what energy system I would like to see eventually, I think I'd like to see solar power around the world and global electric grids that could wheel energy from day to night. But we don't have the storage technologies or the transmission technologies to do that today. And so the question is, what near zero emission technologies can we deploy today? And so I think we should be building nuclear power plants today, but I see that as transition to some long-term sustainable future energy system.
Okay. We have a microphone over here and a question. If there's any journalists, we're running quite short on time at this point, so we're going to take a few more questions. Maybe we'll take this question from this gentleman. Is there another journalist here in this area that would like to ask? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, the next German. Bernhard Pötter with the German newspaper Die Tageszeitung. Hi. I was wondering if you could tell us something on the economic side of your study. Are those your calculations that nuclear energy in that sense is cheaper, is economically feasible, or where did you get it? As far as what I see from the brochure, I didn't see if you calculated the cost for waste disposal in there. And I'm asking this because here in France there's a big debate on the cost of nuclear energy. Both EDF and Areva, the big companies here, are basically broke with tens of billions in the debt. And EDF basically asking for a price hike of 30% in the electricity. So I was wondering what's the basis for these calculations? Thank you.
Well, I can make a couple of comments relevant to that question, and then I'll pass the microphone. If you followed the present, the power plant that France and Europe is building in Finland, and their incompetence in doing that, and frankly choosing a design which inherently is going to be exceedingly difficult, then I would be skeptical about the role of nuclear power. But there's no reason that you need to let that be the source of future nuclear power. If you look even at China today, they're able to build a power plant in 5 years for $2 billion, which in the United States would probably take you 15 years. And you know, I have a long history working with environmentalists and listening to their strategies, and many of them are anti-nuclear. And part of their admitted strategy was, let's make it as difficult as possible to build a nuclear power plant. And it takes 15 years in the United States. And that makes it expensive. But there are options now. There are, you'll have to get to the point of where you have a standard design, possibly even a modular design that you make in a factory. And I'm sure that China and India are going to go those paths, and they're going to find ways to build nuclear that will be very cost competitive. But as I say, competing, put a price on carbon and let these technologies compete. And my bet would be that nuclear would do very well, but that remains to be proven.
When solar and wind are too expensive, people say, let's do deployment to drive down the learning curve, let's do R&D to make the technology cheaper. If nuclear power is too expensive, we should treat it the same way we treat solar and wind and say, let's drive down the learning curve, let's do the R&D to make it less expensive.
I just want to say one little thing about waste, and that is, right now, in many parts of the world, we are storing waste on site in dry cask containers, and they are meant to have a safe lifetime of maybe 300 years. At Fukushima, for example, a lot of waste was stored in dry casks, and they survived the tsunami perfectly well. So that's a very secure way on a multi-century timescale, you know, 100 to 200 years or so, of storing waste while we figure out the best possible way to store waste on a longer time scale. Now, I mentioned already that next generation neutron reactors have much less waste, and the very long-lived actinides, the plutonium, for example, are used up to produce energy. So, you know, the million-year timescale issue basically disappears if we go to the next generation of nuclear technology. I could go on a lot about waste in this. There's a little bit about waste in this nuclear energy fact sheet, which fleshes out some of the things that I've said.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Yves Marignac. I'm running a small consultancy office in France called Wise Paris, which just produced a report on nuclear and climate issue commissioned by the French Climate Action Network, and which concludes that in terms of efficiency and consistency, nuclear is not a good option. I could discuss a lot, of course, but I won't. Just simply want to say that your defiance towards renewables and your confidence towards nuclear power is kind of the opposite of their current dynamics to deliver carbon-free electricity. But I have just one question, which comes back to the debate we had in France 2 years ago about our energy transition. And I was part of the team with the minister organizing it, which concluded that the most effective scenarios to get our emissions in France down fourfold, which is what we need to be in the 2 degrees scenarios. The most effective scenarios are those where nuclear power is either phasing out or at least reducing, and not those where we maintain nuclear power where it stands. That's my question. How do you interpret that?
I would just like to push back on this idea that I don't like solar and wind, that you're acting like, as I just said, that my dream future system was a solar-based system, and then you're telling me that we're somehow saying bad things about solar and wind, and it's just not true. We're just saying that nuclear should be allowed to compete in the marketplace on the same basis as solar and wind. So I think the premise of your question is wrong.
I would like to say for the nth time that if we put a price on carbon and let that rise and let these compete, then we will find out. And I can, you know, I would argue that what we're going to find is that China is going to develop nuclear, and it's going to, it will find a market for it. And I feel sorry for my grandchildren that our country will be economically deprived if we do not use the tremendous knowledge and expertise in physical sciences that we have in our great universities, and use that in order to be economically competitive. Because my guess would be, and this is just my personal opinion, I think we're going to find that advanced generation nuclear is going to be fundamental to providing energy to the world population, and we're wasting an opportunity if we don't develop our technology.
Okay, I would like to, ask, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think we should ask our scientists to wrap up, and then we'll have some time afterwards for media interviews. So, would you like to kick off? Yeah.
Yeah, just to say that I think there's been some a problem in how nuclear power has been discussed in the past that I think we need to get beyond. That sometimes it's presented as if somehow nuclear is against wind and solar, where in my conception, nuclear is essential to helping wind and solar close that energy gap. And also sometimes it's framed in terms of proponents of nuclear power against environmentalists. I consider myself an environmentalist. I've been working my whole life to protect the environment. And that I think real environmentalists who look at the issues in a quantitative way will come to see that nuclear power can potentially play a huge role in helping people get out of poverty while protecting the environment.
So the the basic problem, and I think the reason that there's a bit of controversy about all of this, is that we scientists, we climate scientists, feel, I think quite rightly, that we are under the gun. We have to do things right now. I could rattle off, and I'm sure my colleagues could rattle off, all kinds of technologies that are right around the corner, both nuclear and renewable technology, that will help us a lot. We've talked about fourth generation nuclear, but unfortunately that's probably 10 to 15 years away in terms of commercial production. That's why I advocate deploying light water reactors, even though they're inferior technology. In the solar realm, I think there's a reasonable chance that we may have some breakthroughs in storage. And my colleagues at MIT, among others, are working very hard on that. And if that happens, it will be wonderful. There are many, many examples I could cite like that. The problem is we don't have time. So while we should very much develop that, and I, of course, very much agree with Jim and others that the best way to do that is to price carbon and let the market determine these things. But we have to do it now. We can't wait for magic to happen. We have to start now and hope that we can develop better technologies to deploy when they're ready.
Yeah, I just want to endorse the issue of pricing carbon. I think that's really important. You know, there are ways to even phrase pricing carbon, and often the word tax is a bad word to use, even though effectively putting a price on target through cap and trade or whatever is essentially the same as taxing. It's sometimes good just to use the right words. And in that regard, in Australia, for example, they have a renewable energy target. Nuclear is not counted as renewable energy. What we should have is a clean energy target or a carbon-free energy target. And that's crucial. The wording can sometimes be really important in determining the pathways we take towards the future.
Well, I guess my final word would still be on the carbon fee, because I do want to clarify that indeed cap and trade is a tax, and that's why conservatives rephrase it as cap and tax, because it increases the prices, and that's a tax on the public. Therefore, whenever I talk about this, I talk about a carbon fee with 100% of the money distributed to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents. It spurs the economy, and it's not a tax. It does not give one dime to the government. So that, if we have that, then we could solve this problem. And the reason I came to this COP, the first one I've ever come to, is because I could smell that the governments were planning the same trick that they played in Kyoto, that they're going to pretend that they've done something important. If they do not agree on a carbon fee, then they are kicking the problem down the road. And we'll still have to come back to this at the next COP, because if fossil fuels are allowed to continue to be the cheapest energy in the views of the public, then we're just going to keep burning them. So we've got to come to grips with the fundamental problem, and that is we have to make the prices honest by including the external costs of the fossil fuels in their price.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you to our scientists. We've heard about the scale and the urgency of the challenge. And this unprecedented meeting for Ken, for Kerry, for Jim, it's their first time that they've come to COP to issue this call to rise above ideology, rise above prejudice, and focus on a rational strategy. Thank you, and please thank our scientists in the usual way. Thank you.
Jim, can I grab you right here? Can you come down?